Colorado Territory, 1878. The morning the circuit judge slammed his gavel and sentenced Caleb Brand to marry the witch of Whisper Creek. It was 12 degrees, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Either you marry the woman, or you spend the next 10 years in the territorial prison for cheating a man of means, the judge said, his voice as flat and cold as the frost on the courtroom window. Caleb, 28, lean and with a fresh bruise, darkening his jaw from the town marshal's fist, stared across the room at the woman in question. Elara. He'd heard the whispers about her in the saloon before his card game went south. A recluse who lived in her father's old ruined forge up the creek. A woman whose face was scarred by a fire that had killed her family years ago. They called her a witch because it was easier than calling her a survivor. She stood straight-backed and silent in a patched but clean gray dress, her dark hair pulled into a severe braid. A fine, silvery network of scars traced a path from her temple down her left cheek, pulling at the corner of her mouth and giving her a permanent, somber expression. She wasn't ugly, Caleb thought, not in the way the gossips described. She was just marked by a tragedy so deep it had become a part of her skin. She did not look at him. She looked at the wall behind him, as if she would rather be anywhere but here. Caleb swallowed the bitter taste of defeat. I'll marry her. Elara's dark eyes, clear and startlingly direct, flicked to his for a single, unreadable moment. She blinked once, but said nothing. The courtroom rustled with a mixture of shock and morbid satisfaction. The judge slammed his gavel again. Then, by the law of this territory, the marriage will be witnessed and signed by sundown. Case closed. And just like that, Caleb Brand, a wandering blacksmith who lived by his wits and the turn of a card, became a husband. Wedding took place in the back room of the marshal's office. The witnesses were a reluctant preacher who smelled faintly of whiskey and a clerk whose ink-stained fingers trembled as he filled out the paperwork. Snow drifted through the cracks in the window frame, melting into gray puddles on the floor. Elara did not cry. She did not smile. She signed the marriage certificate with a steady hand, the scarred skin on her cheek tightening with the effort. When it was done, she stepped back and looked at Caleb. Do not expect me to pretend this is anything other than what it is, she said, her voice low and surprisingly steady. Caleb shoved his hands into his worn coat pockets. I'm not expecting anything at all. They rode in silence to her home, 3 miles up a winding, frozen creek. The wagon, provided by the mining boss Silas Thorne, the very man Caleb had tried to cheat Crete under the weight of supplies. Blankets, coffee, a sack of flour, and a new set of blacksmithing tools. Let it not be said, the court lacked a certain cruel generosity. The place was even more dilapidated than the rumors suggested. A sagging 2-room cabin connected to a stone forge with a half-collapsed roof. A chicken coop held a single defiant-looking hen, and a collapsed shed listed sideways into a snowdrift. Elara helped him unload the wagon without a word. Her hands were red from the cold, her nails blunt from hard work, her shoulders strong beneath her thin dress. Inside, the stove barely held a fire. The air smelled of wood smoke, ash, and something herbal he couldn't place. She lit a lantern and handed it to him, the gesture practical, not welcoming. That room's mine, she said, gesturing to a closed door. You can take the loft. Fine, he said. It was more than he deserved. That night, Caleb lay awake on a thin straw mattress in the cold loft, staring up at the dark, snow-dusted rafters. He was married to a woman he did not know, in a place that felt like the edge of the world, all because he had tried to cheat the wrong man. He had spent his life lying, gambling, and fast-talking his way out of trouble. But as he listened to the profound, unnerving silence from the room below, he had a sinking feeling that nothing had prepared him for the quiet resilience of Elara. The Witch of Whisper Creek, or the way she had looked at him, not with fear or pity, but like he was a stain on her floor that she was now, by law. The first week of their marriage was a lesson in silence. Caleb and Elara moved around each other in a small, cramped cabin like two wary, circling wolves. They were bound by a judge's decree, but a chasm of mistrust and resentment separated them. Caleb, accustomed to a life of movement and easy words, found the quiet oppressive, a constant, nagging reminder of his failure. Elara's silence was different. It was a shield, a self-contained fortress she had built around herself, and he had no idea how to breach its walls. He woke each morning before dawn to the sound of her already moving about below, stoking the fire in the forge, her movements economical and precise. He would descend from the cold loft to find a cup of hot, bitter chicory coffee waiting for him on the rough-hewn table. They would eat their meager breakfast of hard biscuits or oatmeal without exchanging a word. Then they would work. He was a blacksmith by trade, and despite his gambling habits, he was a good one. He set about repairing the ruined forge, his hammer ringing out in the cold mountain air, a sound that was both a comfort and a declaration. He was trapped here, but he would not be idle. Elara worked with a tireless, methodical energy that both shamed and impressed him. She tended her small, half-frozen garden, patched the leaky roof of the cabin with tar and canvas, and cared for the single hen with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her hardened exterior. She never asked for his help, but she never refused it when he offered. He helped her rehang a heavy barn door, his strength complementing her ingenuity. She, in turn, sharpened his tools on her father's old whetstone until they held an edge better than any he could manage himself. They were not partners, not yet, but they were a functioning, if silent, machine of survival. He learned things about her in those first few days. He learned she kept bees in the spring, their empty hives now silent under a blanket of snow. He learned she baked her own dense, dark bread once a week. And he learned she knew how to shoot. He saw her one afternoon, standing at the edge of the woods with an old hunting rifle, bringing down a rabbit with a single, clean shot. On the 7th day of their strange cohabitation, he found her outside, trying to fix the collapsed chicken, coop with a hammer and a nail held between her teeth. Snow swirled around her, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. "You know," he said, leaning against a fence post, "you could just ask me to do that." She glanced at him, her dark eyes unreadable, then pulled the nail from her mouth. "Are you planning to run off the moment the thaw comes?" The question caught him off guard. "No," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "Then you will need to learn to pull your own weight around here," she replied, her voice flat. She turned back to the coop. Caleb felt a reluctant grin touch his lips. Fair enough. He rolled up his sleeves and joined her, his frustration with his situation momentarily forgotten in the simple shared act of labor. 2 weeks passed. The snow stopped, and the sun began to show its face for a few hours each day. They repaired the collapsed shed and stacked the wood he cut into neat, towering piles. Caleb patched the rest of the roof, dug out the frozen creek bed to ensure a clear flow of water come spring, and tried not to stare too long at Elara when she bent over the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the firelight catching the faint, silvery scars on her cheek. One evening, as he was feeding the fire, she brought him a mug of coffee. He blinked, surprised by the unsolicited act of kindness. "Thanks," he mumbled. She nodded and sat in the chair across from him, folding her scarred hands in her lap. "I know what they say about me in town," she said quietly, her voice devoid of self-pity. He looked up, meeting her direct gaze. "The witch. The scarred girl? I've heard it since I was a girl." He said nothing, not knowing what to say. "It doesn't bother me like it used to," she went on. But I will not be pitied, and I will not be mocked in my own home. I wasn't mocking you, he said, his voice rough. She nodded once, seeming to accept this. And she asked, "Why did you agree to marry me instead of taking the prison sentence?" He shrugged, staring into the fire. "I've been in a cell before. Down in Texas, I wouldn't last 10 years in Deer Lodge." She seemed to weigh that for a moment, then stood. "We are not strangers anymore, Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But we are not husband and wife either. Not in the way it counts." He watched her walk to the door of her small room and close it quietly behind her. That night, he lay on his straw mattress and dreamed not of cards or freedom, but of her face. Not how it looked, but how it made him feel. Solid, still, and strangely, terrifyingly at peace. Another week passed. Caleb fixed the broken axle on the wagon, stitched a tear in Elara's only good dress with clumsy but determined fingers, and learned, through her silent instruction, how to feed the bees their winter sugar without getting stung. He found a strange rhythm in their shared life, a purpose that went beyond simple survival. The constant, gnawing urge to run, to find the next card game, the next easy score, had begun to fade, replaced by the simple satisfaction of a well-mended fence or a neatly stacked woodpile. He was beginning to see the woman, not just the scars. He noticed the way her hands, though rough and marked by fire, were surprisingly nimble as she worked her medicinal herbs, grinding them into salves and teas. He learned that the strange, clean scent in the cabin was a mixture of pine and the wild mint she gathered from the creek bed. She was not a witch. She was an herbalist, a skill she had clearly learned from someone who knew the secrets of the mountains. One morning, while he was chopping wood, he saw her standing by the creek, her sleeves wet, her skirt muddy. She was holding a lint bundle in her hands, scrubbing it on a flat rock with a fierce, almost desperate energy. He dropped the axe and hurried to her side. As he got closer, he saw that the bundle was a child's shirt, small and faded. She didn't look up as he approached. "Letty," he said, using her name for the first time, a name he had learned from the marriage certificate. He had to repeat it. "Elara." "I had 2 brothers," she said, her voice low and tight, still focused on her task. "Nicholas and Eli. We were left here when our parents died in the fire. I raised them." She gripped the cloth so tightly. Her knuckles went white. "They ran off last spring. Said they wanted to go see the railroad. I haven't heard from them since." The shirt in her hands, he realized, must have belonged to one of them. Caleb crouched beside her on the cold, damp ground. "You think they'll come back?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I don't know." He took the shirt from her hands, his fingers brushing hers, and set it carefully aside on the rock. "You shouldn't have to carry all this alone." "I don't have a choice," she said, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "You do now." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Her dark eyes searched his face, as if she were trying to decide if he was another lie, another disappointment. He met her gaze without flinching, letting her see the quiet sincerity there. That night, she made a thick, savory stew, and he washed the dishes without being asked. She let him sit closer to her by the fire, their shoulders occasionally brushing. She didn't pull away. "Why did you really cheat Silas Thorne?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet in the warm room. He sighed, the sound heavy with old regrets. "Because I was broke, hungry, and stupid. I saw an easy mark, a man with more money than sense, and I took my shot. I just didn't realize he owned the dealer, the cards, and the marshal." She nodded, a small, understanding gesture. "Thank you for telling me the truth." He turned his head, surprised. "You believe I can be more than that?" A cheat and a gambler? Yes, she said simply. The word hung in the air between them, small but heavy, like a promise. He reached out and touched her hand where it rested on her knee. She let him. 3 more days passed before he kissed her. It wasn't planned. She had just come in from feeding the single hen, her cheeks red from the cold, her eyelashes dusted with fresh snow. She was laughing softly at something he had said, a real, genuine laugh, not the polite, guarded sound he was used to, and he found he couldn't help himself. He stepped forward, lifted her chin with a calloused finger, and kissed her. She froze for a heartbeat, her eyes wide with surprise. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she kissed him back. Her hands went to his coat, gripping the rough fabric. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. And the cold outside, the pain of her past, the weight of his mistakes, all of it faded, away into the warmth of that single, tentative connection. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "Are you sure?" He nodded, his forehead resting against hers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She smiled, a real, true smile that reached her eyes and crinkled the scars on her cheek. And in that moment, Caleb thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The days began to stretch longer as February waned, and the snow on the south-facing slopes of the valley started to melt into slush. The earth, still hard and frozen beneath, gave little, but Ilara began to turn her garden beds anyway. Caleb watched from the forge roof, a hammer in his hand, as she broke the frozen ground with rhythmic, determined strikes, as if spring might come faster if she willed it. He felt a shift in the air, a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. He climbed down, his boots slipping slightly on the thawing rungs of the ladder. When he reached her, she didn't stop working, but she asked, "Are you any good with trees?" He adjusted the collar of his shirt, a nervous habit he developed under her direct gaze. "Depends on what sort of tree we're talking about." "Apple. There are 3 old ones down by the fence line. I think 2 of them are dead." He glanced past her shoulder to the gnarled, skeletal shapes at the edge of their property. "I'll take a look." "Don't bother unless you mean it." "I do," he said. She let the heavy hoe rest against the dark soil. "Then bring the saw and your gloves. There will be rot." The apple trees were older than either of them, wide, twisted things with branches like arthritic arms. As he'd suspected, 2 had no buds at all, just brittle, dead limbs and bark that peeled back to reveal decaying wood. The 3rd, however, clung to life, small green nubs just beginning to swell at its tips. Caleb squatted beside the largest of the dead trunks, brushing away moss. "This one's gone," he said. "No saving it." She stood behind him, her arms crossed over her chest. "I figure as much." He rose and looked at her. Still worth planting something new in its place. She didn't answer right away. "Then I thought about peaches once, but they don't take well this far north." "You think about things like that much? For yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, unexpected. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "Not for a long time." That night, they sat at the table after supper, the lamp burning low. Caleb unfolded a torn scrap of paper he'd been carrying for years, and laid it flat. It was a crude, hand-drawn map of the territory, marked in faded pencil. "Is this yours?" she asked. "Kind of. Picked it up off a drunk down in Miles City. Most of it's probably wrong, but some of the water lines are close." "Why do? You keep it?" He tapped a crooked bend in a line labeled Bitterroot. "Because I want to see what's past this line one day. Not running from something, just going." She traced the edge of the map with a fingertip. "Have you ever thought of staying put instead?" He tilted his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Is that a proposal?" "No." She looked at him then, her gaze steady and open. "It's a question." He folded the map slowly, carefully. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know I don't want to leave here. Not if it means leaving you." She blinked, but she didn't look away. "You mean that?" "I do." In the weeks that followed, Alara began to let him into her world in small, significant ways. She handed him her mother's tattered recipe book one morning, flipping to a page marked with waxy pencil lines. "Make the biscuits while I milk the goat," she'd said. He had laughed. "You trust me with flour now?" "I trust that you'll follow directions," she'd replied, a rare flash of humor in her eyes. "And that you'll clean up the mess after." He did. They ate them hot from the oven with blackberry preserves she'd put up the previous summer, and she had leaned back in her chair afterward, her eyes closed. "That's not bad." "I'll take it," he'd said. When the creek thawed enough to run clear, Caleb built a small footbridge from split cedar logs. Alara didn't ask him to. She found him halfway through, his shirt off, his shoulders streaked with sweat and sawdust. She had simply watched for a moment and said, "You missed a nail on that crossbeam." He had grinned. "I'll let you fix it." She did. Mid-March brought a letter. The postman, a rare visitor, dropped it off without a word, just a tip of his hat before riding on. The envelope was thin, the handwriting cramped and unfamiliar. Alara opened it alone outside, her back to the cabin. She came back in a few minutes later, her cheeks blotchy, a folded square of paper clutched in her hand. "They're alive," she said, her voice hitching once. He didn't need to ask who. She read the letter aloud, her voice gaining strength with each word. Her brothers, Nicholas and Eli, were alive and well, working with a logging crew up near the Clearwater River in Idaho. They were heading east come autumn. They wanted her to know they were together and safe. "Do you want to go to them?" Caleb asked when she had finished. She looked toward the window, toward the mountains that stood between her and them. "I want them to come home," she said. "But they won't, not yet. They have to make their own way now." He stood and walked to her, resting a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry that hope alone anymore." She leaned into him then, for the first time without any hesitation, her body finally letting go of a burden she had carried for too long. That night, she led him into her small room. There were no candles, no grand declarations, only a quiet folding of space between them, a final letting in. In the morning, she cooked eggs and let her dark braid fall loose down her back. He kissed the back of her neck while she stirred the pan, and she didn't pull away. Later, while they were mending the fence line, she said, her voice thoughtful, "Do you miss the man you were before all this?" He shook his head without hesitation. He never had anything worth holding on to. She looked at him, her eyes soft. "You do know." "I know," he said. By April, the last of the snow had retreated to the high peaks, and the valley floor was alive with the promise of spring. The air smelled of thawed earth and the sharp, clean scent of pine. The bees had begun to stir again in the hives near the edge of the field, and Alara would check them each morning, her scarred fingers surprisingly nimble and gentle, even through her thick gloves. Their life had found a quiet, steady rhythm, measured not by the clock, but by the sun and the seasons. Work was hard and constant, but it was shared. Caleb's strength and Alara's knowledge of the land made them a formidable team. He cleared the fields of the rocks that winter had pushed to the surface, and she showed him which wild greens were safe to eat. He repaired the forge until it was fully functional again, the ring of his hammer a defiant, hopeful sound in the valley. She, in turn, established a large, thriving garden, her hands seeming to coax life from the stubborn mountain soil. Their alliance, once born of necessity, had been forged into a true partnership. They were no longer two strangers forced together by circumstance, but a man and a woman building a life, piece by piece, with their own two hands. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a comfortable space filled with unspoken understanding. One evening, after she'd set a shallow dish of sugar water near the hives for the early scouts, she turned to him at the water pump. "Did you ever have a family of your own?" she asked, her sleeves rolled and damp. Caleb leaned on the pump handle, wiping his hands on his trousers. The question didn't sting as it once would have. "My pa died when I was 12, he said. "After that, I moved between ranch hand jobs and card tables. Never stayed in one place long enough to belong anywhere." She reached into the basin beside her, rinsing a rag. "No brothers, no sisters? No one who stayed?" "There was a girl once, down in Kansas," he admitted. "I was 17. We talked about marriage, but I left before spring came." Elara wrung out the cloth slowly. "Were you afraid you'd fail her?" He looked out at the distant mountains. "I knew I would," he said honestly. She nodded once, a gesture of understanding, then walked past him toward the house without another word. The next morning, Caleb found her in the loft, sorting through old wooden crates filled with her mother's things. Dust rose in soft clouds in the morning light as she lifted out a folded quilt, its corners frayed from years of use. "You looking for something in particular?" he asked from the ladder. She didn't look up. "No, just thinking it's time to put some of this to use again." He crouched beside her and picked up a small, carved wooden comb from the corner of the box. The teeth were chipped, but the wood was smooth with age. "Did your mother make this?" "She did." Her voice was even. "She carved it after my brother Nicholas was born. Said she didn't want to lose herself entirely to dirt and diapers." Caleb set it aside gently. The pain of her past was still there, a tangible presence in the dusty air of the loft. He touched her scarred wrist. "You don't have to keep her things in boxes anymore, Elara." She finally met his gaze. "I'm not." By May, the soil was soft enough for planting. Elara placed each seed by hand, spacing them with a quiet, reverent precision. Caleb dug the furrows and hauled water from the creek, but she chose what went where: beans along the far row, turnips near the edge, and squash in the sunny patch by the creek. The last bed she saved for flowers. "Why flowers?" he asked, watching her press marigold seeds into the black, rich soil. "They're not useful." She looked up at him, a small, secret smile on her lips. "Because I can," she said. Night, they sat outside on the porch steps, their boots off. The sky stretched wide and purple above them. The first stars were flickering like struck flint. "Do you ever think about having a child?" she asked quietly, her voice barely louder than the chirping crickets. He turned his head toward her, the air still warm from the day. "Not until I met you," he said, the truth of it surprising even himself. She didn't speak for a while. "Then I used to think my only purpose was to raise Nicholas and Eli, and then I would be alone. I figured if I could make their lives better, that would be enough." "You don't have to settle for enough anymore, Elara." The porch floor creaked as she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. Would you want to raise a child here? In this place?" He laid his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. "I would," he said. And he meant it. A week later, they walked the high ridge above the creek, the wind chasing clouds across the greening hills. The world felt new, washed clean by the spring rains. Elara paused beside a patch of wild lupine, its purple spires brushing against her skirts. She crouched, picked a single stalk, and held it out to him. "Pretty," he said, taking it from her. "They're poisonous to cattle," she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. "But they hold the soil in place when the heavy rains come." He twirled the stem between his fingers. "That sounds a little like you." She turned her head, her cheeks flushed, not from the sun. "Do you mean that?" "I do." They returned to the house in a comfortable silence, but her hand found his halfway down the trail, and she didn't let go. The next morning, she laid a folded, yellowed paper on the table. It was the deed to the property, her father's, long untouched. The ink faded from age. "I want to add your name," she said, her voice clear and steady. He stared at it, a knot forming in his throat. This land, this forge, it was all she had left of her family. "Elara, you don't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but I want to." He looked up at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, at the trust she was offering him so freely. "You trust me with that? With everything?" "I trust you with everything," she affirmed. He looked at her standing there, straight and proud, her expression no longer braced against the world, but open to it, open to him. "All right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then I'll earn it." "You already have," she whispered. They signed the document together that afternoon at the kitchen table, and he carried it into town himself, feeling the weight of it in his pocket like a precious, fragile thing. When he returned that evening, the house was warm with the smell of baking bread and melting beeswax. Elara met him at the door, her dark braid loose down her back, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "You're home," she said. "I am," he answered. And for the first time in his life, he truly meant it, the intimacy they had been building. Between them, a slow, steady fire finally reached its flashpoint that night. The children were long asleep, and a quiet peace had settled over the cabin. Caleb was banking the fire in the forge, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel against the stone, a familiar, comforting sound. The air was cool, smelling of hot metal and charcoal. Elara came to stand in the wide doorway of the forge, a silhouette against the moonlit yard. She was holding 2 mugs of hot cider, the steam rising in faint wisps. She didn't speak, just held one out to him. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The simple contact sent a jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the cider. They stood there for a long moment, sipping the hot, sweet drink, surrounded by the quiet hum of the night. He looked at her, at the way the moonlight caught the silver of her scars, transforming them from marks of tragedy into lines of a beautiful, intricate map. He saw not the witch of Whisper Creek, but Elara, a woman of incredible strength, quiet dignity, and a heart that had survived the fire. He set his mug down on the anvil. He stepped toward her, and she did not back away. He gently traced the line of the scar on her cheek with the tip of his finger. She closed her eyes, a faint tremor running through her. "You are not what they call you," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I know," she replied, her eyes still closed. "And you are not the man who rode into town that day." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of reverence, of acknowledgement, of 2 broken souls finally finding their missing pieces in each other. It was slow and gentle, and it tasted of cider and wood smoke and the promise of a future. When he pulled back, her eyes opened, dark and deep and full of a light he had never seen there before. The last of the walls had crumbled, leaving nothing but the raw, honest truth between them. They were home. June brought long, warm days and thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like low drums, shaking the windows of the cabin and leaving the air thick with the scent of wet hay and pine. Elara stood on the porch one evening, her apron damp, watching the lightning strike far off beyond the Burrtooth Mountains. Caleb leaned against the post beside her, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the scent of wood smoke still clinging to him from the forge. "I used to be afraid of thunder," she said, her voice a low murmur. He glanced at her. "What changed?" "I had to get the animals into the barn once during a storm. Nicholas was crying. Eli wouldn't come out from under the bed. I couldn't be afraid and help them at the same time. He nodded, understanding. You don't always get that choice. No, she said, but I don't mind it anymore. It reminds me I'm still here. A sharp crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, and she didn't flinch. Caleb reached for her hand without thinking. Her fingers curled around his, firm and warm, and neither of them pulled away. Their peace, however, was not destined to last. It was broken by the arrival of a rider a week later. He was a man in a trail-worn coat and a soft, wide-brimmed hat, dust clinging to his boots. Alara spotted him from the garden and wiped her hands on her skirt as she approached the house. Caleb stepped out from the barn. His expression immediately guarded Dot. It was Silas Thorne, the mining boss whose cheated anger had sentenced Caleb to this life in the first place. He dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene with a smug, proprietary air, the mended fences, the thriving garden, Alara standing on the porch, no longer a frightened recluse, but the confident mistress of her home. "Well, well, Brand," Thorne said, his voice slick with false congeniality. "It seems marriage agrees with you. And the lovely Alara. You're looking healthier. What do you want, Thorne?" Caleb said, his voice flat. "I've come on a matter of business," Thorne said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "It seems when I arranged for this union, I was unaware of a certain asset tied to this property." He looked directly at Alara. "Your father, my dear, was a known prospector, a clever one. Before he died in that unfortunate fire, it's rumored he discovered a significant gold claim in these hills, and that he left a map." Alara's face went still, her expression unreadable. "I have reason to believe that map is here," Thorne continued, his voice losing its friendly tone. "And as the man who generously funded your new life, I believe I have a right to a share. A majority share, in fact." Caleb stepped forward. "There's no map, and you have no claim here." Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't I? Let me remind you, Brand, of the terms of your release. 10 years of hard labor, waived in exchange for this marriage. But a judge can always be persuaded to revisit a sentence, especially if new evidence of uncooperativeness comes to light." The threat was clear. Give him the map, or Caleb would go to prison, leaving Alara alone and unprotected. "You won't find anything," Alara said, her voice cold as ice. "Oh, I think I will," Thorne sneered. "I will search this place from top to bottom. I will tear it apart, board by board, if I have to. The choice is yours. Give me the map, and I will leave you to your pathetic little life. Refuse, and I will take everything from you, starting with your husband." He turned to leave, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I'll be back tomorrow morning with some men to help me look. I suggest you have the map ready for me." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving them in a stunned, heavy silence. The shadow of the past, a past neither of them had chosen, had returned to threaten the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build. Their home, their future, it all balanced on a map that might not even exist. That night, the cabin felt small and confining, the walls pressing in on them. Thorne's threat hung in the air, a poison that soured the taste of their simple supper. They sat at the table in a heavy silence, the half-finished biscuits growing. "Cold between them? Is it true?" Caleb finally asked, his voice low. "Was your father a prospector?" Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. "He was. He spent his life searching for a single rich vein, the one he called the heart of the mountain. He claimed he found it just a few months before the fire." She paused. "But he never told me where. He said it was too dangerous. He said he was being followed." "And the map?" "If there is one, I've never seen it," she said. And he knew she was telling the truth. They spent the next few hours in a frantic, desperate search, turning the cabin upside down. They looked through her father's old books, pried up loose floorboards, and sifted through the dusty contents of the loft. They found nothing. By midnight, they sat exhausted and defeated in the middle of the disordered room. "He'll come in the morning," Caleb said, his voice grim, "and he'll tear this place apart. Whether he finds a map or not, he won't leave us in peace." Elara looked around the small cabin, at the life they had started to build. She looked at the new shelves Caleb had built, at the curtains she had sewn, at the small wooden cradle he had been carving in his spare time. A fierce, protective anger began to burn away her fear. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He will not take this from us." She stood up and walked into the forge. Caleb followed her, confused. The forge was cold and dark, the only light coming from the lantern he carried. Elara walked to the great stone hearth, the one her father had built with his own hands. She ran her scarred fingers over the surface of the stones, her touch reverent. "Father loved this forge more than anything," she whispered. "He said it was the only place he felt truly at home. He said he put his heart into these stones." Her fingers stopped on a single large river stone set just above the opening of the hearth. It was darker than the others, and as Caleb brought the lantern closer, he saw that its surface was not smooth. It was covered in a series of faint, almost invisible lines and symbols, carved into the rock. It wasn't a map made of paper and ink. It was a map made of stone. They spent the rest of the night deciphering the strange markings, a puzzle left by a dead man. Elara's memory of her father's stories and Caleb's knowledge of the local terrain were the keys. A carving of a soaring hawk indicated a specific peak. A symbol for a snake meant a winding creek. Piece by piece, they unlocked the secret. The heart of the mountain was real. It was located in an old abandoned mine shaft, high on the northern ridge of their property. Thorn and his 2 hired thugs arrived the next morning. Caleb and Elara were waiting for them. "Have you found my map?" Thorn asked, dismounting with a smug smile. "We have," Caleb said calmly, "but it's not yours." Thorn's smile vanished. "We'll see about that." He and his men started toward the cabin, but Caleb held up a hand. "It's not in the house," he said. "It's up at the old North Star mine. We'll take you there." Thorn, his greed overriding his caution, agreed. They led them up the steep, treacherous path to the abandoned mine. The entrance was a dark, gaping hole in the side of the mountain, its support timbers rotting and collapsed. "It's in there," Caleb said, pointing into the darkness, "at the very back of the main tunnel." Thorn, eager to claim his prize, pushed past them and entered the mine, his men following close behind. As soon as they were inside, Caleb and Elara moved. They had spent the hour before dawn rigging a simple but effective trap. With a single, powerful heave on a rope they had hidden, they pulled a key support beam loose. With a deafening roar, the entrance to the mine collapsed, tons of rock and earth sealing Thorn and his men inside their greedy tomb. It was not murder. It was mountain justice. There was enough air to last them for a few days, and another way out on the far side of the mountain, a week's journey on foot. They would live, but their power in the valley was broken. Caleb and Elara walked back, down the mountain, their hands clasped together. They did not look back. They had a home to rebuild, a garden to tend, and a future to forge. Their marriage had been born of a sentence, a punishment. But what they had built together, in the heart of the mountains, was a life born of love, resilience, and a quiet, unshakable freedom. And that was a treasure far more valuable than gold.